Today we're going to talk about data binding to a Shuffleboard widget. And what data binding allows you to do is to have data or other telemetry streaming from your robot to be connected to a widget so that your widget can provide some sort of a display of that data. And so what I have here is I have the outline viewer open as the network table server, and I have a few variables defined in it, two number variables, and you notice that as soon as Shuffleboard starts up, it connects to the network table server. And you can see that the variables are in the Shuffleboard data source display, and if I make a change to one of the numbers in outline viewer, it reflects the change in the data source or the network table's data source. So one of the things you can do is you can bind maybe a slider bar to a variable, and you'll notice that you can change the slider bar and it will change the number in the network table's data source. And a lot of controls also have what are called properties that you can set, and so in this case the properties are changing the number between -1 and 0 for the slider bar. I can change it to make the properties change between 0 and 100, the step of 10, and you notice that the numbers change between 0 and 100. Now, since you have a variable in network tables, you can connect that data to more than one widget, and I can open my data bound widget that we'll talk about making this widget today during this video. And since this is also connected to the Y variable, you can see it change when the Y variable changes with the slider bar. So also in this widget, the properties that are changed, you'll notice that there's several other types of things you can do, like change the tick label color and maybe even the tick mark color, something that is more visible. Can't see it because the tick marks are too small. You can turn off the value that's visible, maybe change the needle type to something big. So when you change these properties and you save your layout, these properties are saved with your layout also. So if you want to make your custom layout, it makes it a bit easier for you to customize it the way that works for you. The first thing we're going to do is create a new widget to add into our plugin library, and I'm starting with the plugin library that I created with the last video. So if you haven't cloned the GitHub project, you should do so now. In order to do this, I'm going to simply add a new class to the project, and I'm going to call it my data bound widget, and I'm going to inherit or have a superclass of simple annotated widget, and click finish. And I'm going to go over to my previously defined widget and just get a copy of these attributes at the top of the class. This help us type them in faster. Paste them here, and I'm going to update them. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to name it, my data bound widget. And I'm going to later create a my data bound widget FXML for the FXML controller. And what you'll notice, if you remember going through the last video, we set the data types to be Boolean here because we weren't dealing with data binding. But this time we're going to put number type. And go ahead and fix these. Okay, so you might be wondering how I know what type to put here, and the answer is pretty simple. So I'm going to use this type explorer, and I'm going to open data type. And this is the base class for all the data types that Shuffleboard supports natively, and if we right click on it and open a type hierarchy, you'll notice that there are two main classes that inherit from data type, and what these define are all the out-of-the-box data types that Shuffleboard supports. And these are pretty much everything you could want out of primitive data types. Shuffleboard does allow you to define your own complex data types, but that's a different task for a different video. Today we'll be concentrating on these basic data types. So I'm going to close this, and the last thing I'm going to change is this generic parameter, and I'm going to use number because that's the data type that this widget's going to support. To complete the new widget, there's a few last things we need to do. I'm going to go back to the plugin implementation, and if you remember, we put in the other widget so that in the get components list, so that Shuffleboard knows that the component exists. I'm going to add the data bound widget here as well. Now the plugin should report that the data bound widget is available in addition to the original widget that was created. Okay, and then last thing is to create the FXML controller. So we create a new FXML document, call it my data bound widget, and go ahead and leave the root element as anchor pane for this one. And let me fix up a few things here. I need to make sure it has an identifier so that we can return it to Shuffleboard when it asks. And I need to identify the controller as my data bound widget. Okay, and let's go back to the widget and wire up the view pane. And we'll say private anchor pane underscore the pane. And down here, return the pane. Okay, and fix those. And now it should compile. Let's go ahead and compile it. And let's execute it. Okay, so if I go down this list, I should be able to find my data bound widget. And there we go. So right now it doesn't do anything. It doesn't show any user interface, but we can bind data sources to it. And because it's a number, it will bind the data source. It's just that we're not doing anything with it at the moment. But one thing that I think is interesting that you can look at is that if I were to add another variable, let's say it's add a string, and give it some value. And remember, we made this widget to be a data bound widget that handles a number type. And so if I move the screen a little bit here and go back to the widget where I can see my console, what happens if I try and bind a string to my widget that doesn't support strings? It gives you a message. Expected a number but found a string. So that tells you that you can specify the data types that your widget supports, and it will not try to bind a data type that your widget does not support. So the next thing I'm going to do is import a gauge control library. It's an open source library called Medusa, that has several different controls that are kind of nice looking. And any of these controls you can use as a widget. It's a very simple number display if you really just break it down to what it does. And in order to do that, all I have to do is put in a dependency in my pom.xml. So let's go over there and go to the dependencies and say add dependency. And for the group ID, I'm going to eu.handsolo, and the library name, or the artifact name, is Medusa, and the version is 7.9. And I click OK and save, and that's all you have to do to add the library. So the next thing to do is to go to the fxml, and we're going to add a few things here. So in the fxml, what I'm going to do is make the widget itself have a minimum width and height. So on the anchor pane, I add an attribute, min width, and I'm going to set it at 400, and min height set at 256. And that'll give us some visualization space so that the gauge looks kind of nice. And now I'm going to add in here a vertical box. So let's open this up, VBox, and let's go ahead and close that. And I'm going to add a few attributes to the VBox. So if you look up the anchor pane on the JavaFX API, what you'll notice, or what it'll tell you, is that it is allowing you to anchor your control to the edges of the pane, so that if you change the size of the pane, that the control will stretch with it based upon how it's attached to the edge of the pane. So I'm going to go ahead and attach my vertical box to all the edges of the pane, and it's pretty simple. Just put in the attribute anchor pane dot top anchor, and for the top, because I want to give some room for the blue title bar on the top of the widget, I'm going to use 15 pixels, and then for the other sides I'm going to just use 0. Bottom anchor equals 0. Left and right are both 0 as well. Okay, so what that does is it allows me to put some controls in the vertical box, and if the widget is resized, the controls resize with it. So just for demonstration purposes, we'll put a label here, and I'll put a preferred width that's pretty big, and this will allow the label to be centered in the widget. Put in some text, and I'm going to do an alignment of center. Okay, and now the gauge. Just type gauge. So Handsolo, or the Medusa library, everything is the gauge. It depends on the skin that you pick that shows what or what the display is going to be. So in this case, I'm going to just put skin type is equal to gauge. And if you look at the data type of gauge, look it up in the type viewer, you can see the different skin types. You know, the picture I showed earlier is showing all the skin types it supports. You can play with changing the skin type as much as you want. And in this case, I'm also going to add an ID to the gauge so that I can use that and do some data binding with the gauge. Okay, the last thing we're going to do is go to the data bound widget and wire up the gauge itself. Okay, let's go ahead and fix this. EU Han Solo Medusa, and we'll compile. So I'm going to go ahead and compile, and we'll test it out and see where we are currently. Alright, build success, and let's run it. So Shuffleboard opens. I'm going to add a new tab. I can go look at my data source, and I can right click on one of the variables, and you'll see my data bound widget show up as one possible widget that we can use with that variable. So let's open that. Let's also open a slider. And so I can change the value with the slider, but the widget doesn't do anything yet because we have more to do. It's a very nice display, and in fact, if you go over here to the widget list and you scroll down to where the widget is, it gives you a nice display of what the widget looks like on the side. So there's actually more to do to make it actually deal with the data, and it's actually pretty simple. You might be surprised. So let's go back to Eclipse and go into the method getView. And if you want to have the gauge update when the data sources update, because we're using the simple annotated widget, it's actually pretty simple. So JavaFX has the concept of binding properties, and what that means is when you have a property that changes and you bind another property to that property, it gets the changes at the same time. So all we really need to do is bind the data source property to the widget property, and it will get the updates. So to do that, I have the gauge dot value property, and I say dot bind, and all you need to bind it to is the data property. In fact, let me do this. If I say this dot data property, you'll notice that it's a property binding of number, and it gets the number from the generic parameter up here at the top of the class definition. So we bind that, save it, and let's compile and see what happens. Okay, and let's run it. Actually, I'm going to just run it without the debugger. Okay. Let's go ahead and bind it to a number slider as well as my widget. So, if I change the number slider, you'll notice that it's changing the widget, but the number slider is only changing between -1 and 1, but my widget goes between 0 and 100. So I'm going to change the properties on the number slider to generate a number between 0 and 100, and step 10. So now my widget is data bound. It's pretty simple. So the last thing to do is to allow for users to customize the view or the look and feel of your widget. So what we might want to do, since our gauge only allows us at the moment by default to have a min of 0 and a max of 100, is to allow people to change the property of min and max value, or min and max of what the control displays. So to do this, I'm going to do this dot export properties. So this is part of the simple annotated widget, and basically all you need to do is put a list of properties you want to export, and they will show up in that property editor when you right click on the widget. So in this case, I'm going to say the gauge dot min prop. Let's see, what is it? Min value property. min value property and the max value property. Max value property. And for purposes of demonstration, I'm just going to export the needle shape property. And there's many more properties. You can experiment with the properties that you want to export. In the GitHub code, I have many properties exported that you can play with too. So I'm going to use the needle type property, okay, just for this demonstration. Okay, and so again, compile and run. And let's run it. Okay, so let's again bind a slider bar, my widget. I'm going to change my slider bar. In this case, I'm going to go between 0 and 250. Step of 10. So now that we're bound, I can go way past 100, and the gauge doesn't do anything past 100. So I right click and go to properties on the gauge. I now have a min value, I have a max value, and I'll say 250. And let's change the needle type to maybe this avionic needle. Or actually, let's try the scientific one. That's kind of neat. And so now I have the ability for it to move between 0 and 250. And that's how you make a data-bound widget. Thanks for watching.